Joining us right now is the former chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisor, now a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, Jason Furman. Jason, good to see you, sir. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to see you.
Your thoughts on how these bills treat state and local tax deductions. What's your take on the tax bills that we're hearing about?
Look, it's pretty awkward when you have the President of the United States selling this as the largest tax cut in history, when you have the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader, up until they changed their language recently, saying this is a tax cut for every single middle-class family. And then you have provisions like this as part of a bill that raises taxes on tens of millions of households. How do you go to those tens of millions of households and say your taxes are going up, even though we're describing this as the biggest tax cut in history? I think that's a real issue as they're trying to push this bill forward.
When you look at the overall package, you've got $1.5 trillion to spend on tax cuts, which was approved in the budget. $900 billion of that number is business cuts, the corporate rate coming down and the pass-through rate. Are you saying that they should not be so focused on cutting corporate taxes?
I'm saying if you paid for those corporate tax cuts, then you wouldn't have had to drain so much money in that area. And if we had a serious conversation about how to reform our tax code, rather than claiming that this is a big tax cut, a massive tax cut, the largest tax cut in history, none of which, by the way, is true, all of which has repeatedly been debunked. So, we're having a conversation that isn't about the actual legislation. The actual legislation would be raising taxes on many, many families.
Jason, this is Mike Murphy. Over the last 8 years, we've seen the deficit double in this country. And now you look at this tax cut, with corporate tax cut, which the premise of it is to fuel growth. Do you not see having a tax code here in this country that's competitive with the entire world? Don't you see that as a way for...
First of all, Mike, you need to check your facts. The deficit was 10% of GDP when President Obama started. It was 3% of GDP when he left. So the deficit...
But it did double. The debt doubled from 10 to 20.
The deficit was cut by two-thirds.
I didn't say in relation to GDP.
No, you actually said the deficit, Mike. You said the deficit.
All right, let's talk about the debt in general. The debt in general has been doubled from 10 to 20. Debt has been doubled under President Obama from 10 to 20 trillion. Do you agree?
But Mike said deficit, so I was just
so let's talk about the debt.
But look, under President Reagan, the debt went up on a percentage basis even more than it did under President Obama. Why? Because he had huge tax cuts that raised the debt. He went back, President Reagan, a year after his huge tax cut and raised taxes in '82, raised them in '83, etc. And even then, the debt went up a lot. That's what's going to happen here. The Congressional Budget Office numbers have the debt going up to nearly 100% of GDP. A month ago, House Republicans voted to pay for this plan. Over 220 Republicans voted for the same thing that I support now. Why won't they still do that?
Yeah. So Jason, I think the issue that we're trying to get at here is if we recovered well under the Obama administration, why were we having surpluses? Why was the government consistently spending? So we had deficits? Because if we looked back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early aughts, I mean, we were running some surpluses. I mean, we've got to figure out how to balance this. If we're going to take in $3.5 trillion in taxes, but we're going to spend $4.1 trillion for the government expenditures, how do we balance it? How do we reconcile this? Can you give me an actionable item that the Congress needs to look at to do this? Because the Democrats aren't coming to the table, but do they have an idea that they can figure this out?
Right. So you're right. Since 1970, we've run for surpluses 4 times. Those 4 times were in the late 90s after 3 budget bills that did a combination of revenue and spending to bring the deficit down. That's the type of approach we should take if we want to deal with the deficit, put revenue on the table, put spending on the table. If we don't want to deal with the deficit and we want to reform our tax code, that's just fine, but let's not make that deficit problem even worse while reforming the tax code.
So where specifically would you cut back?
That was Speaker Ryan's position up until a month ago when he reversed his position. That's what President Trump put into his budget. He put 0 cost to the tax cuts. Now they're $1.5 trillion. Now you're going to tell me growth pays for that. Great. The Treasury career staff should put out a model showing that. Congressional scorekeepers should put out a model showing that. The models don't show that these tax cuts pay for themselves. Why have the Republicans changed their own position from a month ago?
Jason, where specifically would you cut back? Where do you cut spending then?
In this bill, we shouldn't be doing as big a tax cut. So, the corporate rate.
So you don't think a corporate rate
if
going to 20% is a good idea
corporate
then?
rate, if we had a 28% what?
You don't think cutting corporate taxes is a good idea to 20% then?
I don't think we can afford a 20% cut. Look, the Business Roundtable, which is the main business lobbying group, up until a few months ago was asking for a 25% rate, Maria. You have a rate in the mid to high 20s, and you combine that with expensing, you combine that with some of these international reforms, that would give us a very competitive international tax system. It would cost a whole lot less.
Well, the average
than
tax
this bill would.
worldwide is 22%. I mean, it's lower than 28%. So I don't know that is equal to equal in terms of competitiveness, because the rest of the world has a much lower corporate rate. You know that.
Well, first of all, Maria, most of those countries have VAT. So Ireland has a 12.5% corporate rate.
Right.
It has a 23% VAT. That's like a 23% sales tax. That's not what's being proposed here.
Yeah.
Those countries all raise more taxes than the United States. They make up for it in other ways in their tax system. So I guess I'd turn the question back to you. Our taxes right now are 17% of GDP. Would you like them to be 25 to 30% of GDP, like all those countries you just cited?
Well, Jason, but you're talking about the VAT.
The answer is we're not Ireland, we're not Estonia.
But the VAT is completely different than the corporate tax rate, what we're talking about. So Ireland, it's cheaper for companies overseas to invest in the United States than it is for companies in the United States to invest here. And so that's the issue. If we all go to VAT, that would be great. I think Ireland's got a good idea on that. They've got a low corporate tax rate, and then their consumers, the citizens there, actually have the higher tax. That would work well here for us. So I think you're highlighting what we should be doing is like what Ireland's been doing.
Oh, I think there's an argument for switching from a corporate tax to something like a VAT. That's not what this bill does, though. All these countries that lowered their corporate tax rates, they didn't do it by creating the types of huge deficits that this would be leading to here. Moreover, by the way, that 22%, Maria, that's for all countries. That has places like Estonia and Ireland in it. If you look at countries like Germany, Japan, they have tax rates, I believe, in the low 30s.
Well, I don't know that the goal of the
them.
U.S. is wanting to become Germany, but we'll
Right,
see if
but I
any
don't
of
think
this
our goal
passes,
could be-
Jason. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.